He built an $8 billion empire and took every secret to his grave, or so everyone thought. But the night before he died, the 90-year-old billionaire whispered 3 words to his wife that wouldn't let her sleep. Find the letters. Days later, standing before the closet she'd never been allowed to open, she realized. He hadn't taken his secrets with him after all. He'd left them for her to find. Before we go any further, can I ask you for one small favor? This story took me days to write, record, and edit, every frame, every emotion, every sound. It costs you nothing to support me, but it truly means everything. Please, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and comment your location below. I want to know where my amazing viewers are watching from. I read every single comment, and I'll be giving shout-outs in my next video. Today's shout-out goes to Ramon from California, Blossom from Jamaica, Charlotte from San Francisco, and Elizabeth from Zambia. Now back to our story. The funeral had been everything you'd expect for a man worth $8 billion. Dignitaries, politicians, business titans who controlled half the world's wealth. They'd all come to pay their respects to Richard Ashford, the self-made billionaire who'd built an empire from nothing. They spoke of his genius, his philanthropy, his vision. Not one of them mentioned the coldness in his eyes. Not one of them knew about the locked door. Eleanor had lived in luxury most people couldn't even imagine. The penthouse overlooking Central Park. The villa in Monaco. Private jets, designer gowns, jewelry that could fund a small country. She'd had everything except the one thing money couldn't buy. Her husband's heart. For 43 years, she'd slept in a bed bigger than most apartments, on sheets with a thread count she couldn't pronounce, next to a man who felt 1,000 miles away. For 43 years, she'd smiled for cameras, attended galas, cut ribbons at charity events, all while dying a little more inside every single day. They'd had no children. Richard had said he didn't want them, that his empire was his legacy. She'd learned not to argue. She'd learned not to ask questions. She'd learned to live with the silence. But silence has a weight to it. It presses down on you, fills your lungs, makes it hard to breathe. And over 4 decades, that silence had become unbearable. The night before he died, Richard had done something he'd never done before. He'd held her hand. His fingers, thin and papery with age, had wrapped around hers with surprising strength. His eyes, usually so distant and cold, had been filled with something she couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. Or regret. He'd opened his mouth to speak, and she'd leaned in close, desperate for words he'd never given her. His breath smelled of medication and something else, something almost sweet, like old paper and dried flowers. His lips had moved. 3 words. Barely a whisper. Then his hand had gone slack, his eyes had closed, and the machines had started screaming. The doctors had rushed in. She'd been pushed aside. And by the time they'd let her back into the room, he was gone. Those 3 words haunted her now as she stood at the threshold of his closet. 3 words that made no sense. 3 words that had turned her world upside down. Find the letters. The closet was enormous, bigger than the first apartment she'd lived in as a young woman, before Richard, before the money, before everything. His suits hung in perfect rows, organized by color and season. His shoes stood in military precision on custom shelves. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, preserved like a museum to a man who'd never really been there. But Eleanor wasn't looking at the suits or the shoes. Her eyes were drawn to the back wall, to a section that looked slightly different. The paneling didn't quite match. She'd walked past this closet 10,000 times and never noticed. Or maybe she had noticed, and Richard's icy demeanor had warned her not to look closer. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she stepped inside. The scent of his cologne still lingered in the air, mixed with the smell of expensive fabric and shoe leather. She ran her hand along the back panel, feeling for something, anything. Her fingers found a small indentation, barely noticeable. She pressed. The panel swung open. Behind it was a space about 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. And inside that space was a wooden box. Cedar, from the smell of it. old. The kind of box that held memories, not money. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as she lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the bedroom, set it on the bed where she'd spent so many lonely nights, and just stared at it. What would you have done if you were in her place? Would you have opened it immediately, desperate for answers? Or would you have hesitated, afraid of what you might find? Eleanor hesitated. Because deep down, she knew that whatever was in this box would change everything. The life she'd lived, the man she'd thought she'd married, the carefully constructed reality she'd accepted for 4 decades, it would all crumble. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. But then again, she'd never really been ready for any of it. She hadn't been ready to marry a man 20 years her senior. She hadn't been ready for the loneliness of wealth. She hadn't been ready for 43 years of silence. Life doesn't wait for you to be ready. She opened the box. Inside were letters. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. They were tied in bundles with faded ribbon, organized by date. The oldest ones were yellowed with age, the paper brittle and fragile. The newest ones looked recent, written within the last few months. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for the top bundle. The envelopes had no address, no stamps. Just a name written in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Lily. She'd never heard that name before. Not once in 43 years. Richard had never mentioned a Lily. They'd had no close friends with that name. No business associates. No relatives. Nothing. Eleanor opened the first letter. It was dated 52 years ago, 9 years before she'd even met Richard. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. The letter began with, "My darling Lily," and ended with, "Forever yours, Richard." In between was a love letter so tender, so passionate, so full of emotion that Eleanor almost couldn't believe her husband had written it. This was not the cold, distant man she'd known. This was someone else entirely. Someone who knew how to love. Someone who chose his words carefully, who expressed his feelings openly, who promised forever with every sentence. She read about afternoon walks in Central Park. About coffee in a small cafe in the village. About dreams and plans and a future filled with laughter. She read about a young man who was building his first business, working 18-hour days, but who always made time for the woman he loved. Who brought her flowers. Who held her when she cried. Who promised her the world. Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, that had been broken for years. Something else. Something deeper. The foundation of the lie she'd been living. She reached for the next bundle of letters. These were dated later, about 48 years ago. The tone had changed. There was pain now, mixed with the love. Desperation. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. The sun set. The city lights came on. She didn't move. She just sat there, holding the paper, feeling the weight of 50 years of lies and loneliness and love that had gone to all the wrong places. What would you do? Would you burn the letters? Pretend you never found them? Take the money and run? Or would you do what he asked? Would you go to the woman your husband really loved and hand her the proof that you'd never mattered? The next morning, Eleanor got dressed carefully. Not in the designer clothes Richard had bought her, but in something simple. A blue dress she'd chosen herself years ago, something she wore when she wanted to feel like herself instead of like Richard Ashford's wife. She called for a car, not the Bentley, just a regular town car, and gave the driver the Brooklyn address. The building was old but well maintained. Rent-controlled, probably. The kind of place where people lived their whole lives. Eleanor climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, carrying the box of letters, feeling like she was walking toward the edge of a cliff. She knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. An elderly neighbor opened her door, peered out with suspicious eyes. The neighbor spoke softly, sadly. Lily had passed away. 2 months ago. Quietly, in her sleep. Her daughter had made the arrangements. Eleanor felt something strange. Relief, maybe. Or disappointment? Or both? She asked about the daughter. The neighbor said she didn't live here, but she'd been coming by to clean out the apartment. She might be there tomorrow. Eleanor thanked her and left. She went back to the penthouse, back to the lonely rooms filled with expensive things. She set the box on the dining table and stared at it. Richard had wanted her to deliver his apology. But Lily was gone. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd abandoned, the woman he'd written to for 50 years without ever sending a single letter. She died never knowing that he'd thought of her every day. Never knowing that he'd regretted his choice. Never knowing that he'd loved her until his last breath. Was that mercy or cruelty? Eleanor couldn't decide. The next day, she returned to the Brooklyn apartment. This time, the door opened. A woman stood there, maybe in her mid-50s, with Richard's eyes and Lily's smile, though Eleanor didn't know that's what she was seeing. The woman looked tired, surrounded by boxes and the debris of a life being packed away. Eleanor introduced herself simply. Said she'd known Lily, which was a lie, but what else could she say? The woman, whose name was Sarah, invited her in. The apartment was small but filled with light. Photos covered the walls. Sarah as a baby, as a child, as a teenager, as a bride, with her own children. In every photo, there was Lily, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. A woman who looked happy despite everything. A woman who'd built a life that mattered even though the man she loved had walked away. Sarah offered tea. Eleanor accepted. They sat at a small kitchen table that probably cost less than one of Eleanor's throw pillows, and Sarah talked about her mother. About how strong she'd been. How she'd worked 2 jobs to support them. How she'd never complained, never spoke badly about anyone, never let bitterness poison her life. How she'd taught Sarah to be grateful for what they had instead of resentful about what they didn't. Sarah mentioned that her father had been out of the picture. Some businessman who'd gotten her mother pregnant and disappeared. But her mother had never been angry about it. She'd said that sometimes people make impossible choices, and you can either spend your life hating them for it or you can move forward. Eleanor felt tears threatening. She'd come here expecting to find bitterness, anger, lives ruined by Richard's choices. Instead, she'd found grace. The same grace Richard had written about in his letters. Lily had turned her pain into strength. She'd raised a good daughter. She'd lived a full life. She hadn't let Richard's abandonment define her. While Eleanor had spent 43 years in a gilded cage, slowly dying inside. While Richard had spent 50 years drowning in guilt, writing letters he'd never send. Lily had been the one who'd actually lived. Eleanor made a decision then. She asked Sarah if her mother had ever mentioned a man named Richard Ashford. Sarah shook her head. The name meant nothing to her. Eleanor didn't tell her. She didn't give her the letters. She didn't explain that the billionaire whose death had been all over the news was her father. She didn't tell her about the empire built on broken promises. She didn't hand over the guilt and regret and decades of words that would never heal anything. Instead, she asked if Sarah needed anything. Help with the apartment. Help with expenses. Anything at all. Sarah said she was fine, but thanked her for the kindness. Before Eleanor left, she saw a photo on the mantel. Lily, much younger, standing in Central Park. She was laughing, her hair blowing in the wind, pure joy on her face. The photo was old, faded, from a different era. From before Richard had made his choice. From when love had been enough. Eleanor took one last look around the small apartment. This was what Richard had given up. Not wealth or power or prestige. He'd gotten all that. He'd given up this. Light. Laughter. Love. A life that mattered. A woman who would have stood by him through anything. A daughter who would have been proud to call him father. He'd made his choice. He'd chosen wrong. And he'd spent the rest of his life paying for it. But Lily hadn't let his choice destroy her. She'd built something beautiful anyway. That was the twist Eleanor hadn't expected. The woman she'd thought would be bitter and broken had actually been the strongest one of all. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor made her own choices. She sold the penthouse. Too many ghosts. Too many lonely nights. She kept enough money to live comfortably. She wasn't a fool. But the rest, the vast majority of Richard's $8 billion fortune, she put into a trust. For Sarah. For Sarah's children. For the family Richard had abandoned. But she did it anonymously. Through lawyers and legal documents that would ensure Sarah never knew where the money came from. Let her think it was an inheritance from her mother, some insurance policy Lily had kept secret. Let her live without the burden of knowing her father had been a billionaire who'd chosen money over her. Eleanor kept the letters. She didn't burn them, but she didn't share them either. They were Richard's confessions, his private torment. They deserved to stay private. Maybe someday, years from now, someone would find them and wonder about the story they told. Or maybe they'd be thrown away, lost to time, like so many secrets. She moved to a smaller place. A townhouse in the village, not far from where Richard had first met Lily all those decades ago. She started volunteering at a literacy program. Started taking painting classes. Started building a life that was actually hers. One evening, 6 months after Richard's death, Eleanor was walking through Central Park when she saw them. Sarah, with 2 children, feeding the ducks by the pond. The children were laughing. Sarah was smiling. They looked happy. They looked like a family. Eleanor stood at a distance, watching. She thought about Richard's letters. About all those words of love and regret written to a woman who'd never read them. About all those years wasted on guilt instead of joy. And she thought about the choice he'd given her at the end. To deliver his apology. To give them closure. She'd made a different choice. She'd given them something better. She'd given them the freedom to keep living their lives without the weight of his regret. She'd given them what he'd never given her, the chance to be happy without him. Maybe that was the apology they really needed. Sarah's laughter carried across the pond, mixing with the sounds of the children's delight as the ducks scrambled for breadcrumbs. Eleanor watched the way Sarah's hand rested protectively on the smaller child's shoulder. The way she smiled with her whole face, not the careful, practiced smile Eleanor had perfected for cameras and galas. This was real joy. Uncomplicated. Pure. It struck Eleanor then, with the force of revelation, that Richard hadn't just abandoned one family. He'd destroyed 2. Sarah and Lily had lost a father and husband, yes. But they'd also gained something. Freedom from his coldness, his distance, his inability to truly connect. They'd built a life full of warmth in his absence. While Eleanor had spent 43 years in his presence and frozen slowly, like a flower trapped in ice. Who had really suffered more? The ones who were left behind, or the one who was kept? A jogger passed by, and Eleanor turned slightly, pretending to admire the autumn trees. She couldn't let Sarah see her staring. Couldn't risk the awkward encounter, the questions that would follow. She was just another well-dressed older woman in the park, invisible in the way that wealthy widows often were. Seen but not noticed. Present but not really there. The children were older now, Sarah's grandchildren, Eleanor realized. Which meant Richard had great-grandchildren he'd never known about. Had never held. Had never watched grow up. That empire he'd built, that legacy he'd been so desperate to create. None of it mattered as much as these 2 small humans throwing bread to ducks on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor turned away from the pond, from Sarah and the children she'd never meet, and walked toward the sunset. For the first time in 43 years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Not happiness, not yet. But possibility. The sense that there was still time. Still life to be lived. Still a chance to build something real from the ruins of all those wasted years. The path ahead curved through a grove of trees, their leaves burning gold and crimson in the fading light. She'd walked these paths with Richard in the early years of their marriage, back when she'd still hoped that time would thaw his heart. He'd always walked slightly ahead of her, already thinking about the next meeting, the next deal, the next move on the great chessboard of his ambition. She'd learned to match his pace, to stay slightly behind, to be present but not demanding. Now she walked alone, at her own speed, and it felt like freedom. Richard had spent his life trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Eleanor had spent hers waiting for something that would never come. But Lily had understood something they'd both missed. That you don't get to control everything. That sometimes life breaks your heart. That sometimes people make terrible choices. But you always get to decide what you do next. You always get to choose whether you let the pain define you or whether you build something beautiful anyway. Eleanor passed a young couple sitting on a bench, holding hands, lost in each other. She felt a pang, not of jealousy exactly, but of grief for the young woman she'd been. 23 years old, with stars in her eyes, believing that marrying a successful older man was the fairy tale she'd been promised. She'd never questioned why he'd chosen her. Never wondered if she was a means to an end rather than an end in herself. She'd been so grateful to be selected, so honored to be wanted, that she'd never stopped to ask if he actually loved her. Now she knew the answer. And strangely, knowing didn't hurt as much as she'd feared it would. The truth, even when it was painful, was cleaner than the lies she'd been living with. You couldn't heal what you didn't acknowledge. You couldn't grieve what you pretended wasn't dead. A street musician was playing violin near the park entrance. Something classical, melancholy, and beautiful. Eleanor stopped to listen, really listen, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. In Richard's world, you didn't stop for street musicians. You didn't pause to appreciate beauty that wasn't curated, purchased, displayed in the right context. Beauty was something you owned, not something you experienced. She reached into her purse and placed a $50 bill in the musician's open case. He looked up, surprised, and nodded his thanks. She nodded back and moved on, but something about the exchange stayed with her. The simplicity of it. The human connection, however brief. The acknowledgement that beauty and talent deserved to be honored, even when, especially when, it appeared in unexpected places. The letters were still in Eleanor's townhouse, in a box in the back of her closet. Maybe someday she'd look at them again. Maybe someday she'd understand why Richard had held on to them, why he'd written for 50 years to a woman who'd never write back. Maybe someday it would all make sense. But even if it never made sense, even if she spent the rest of her life trying to understand how a man could be so passionate in his letters and so cold in his life, it would be okay. Because understanding Richard was no longer her life's work. She'd spent enough years trying to decode his moods, anticipate his needs, become whatever version of herself might finally earn his love. She was done translating other people's silences. Done making excuses for coldness. Done shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold her. But for now, she let it go. She let Richard go. She let the hurt and the loneliness and the wasted years go. She stepped into the evening air, into the noise and chaos and possibility of the city, and she let herself begin again. The traffic on Fifth Avenue was thick, taxis honking, people rushing home from work or out to dinner, the city in constant motion. She used to find it overwhelming, all this energy and noise. Used to retreat to the penthouse, to the silence and isolation that felt safer than engagement. But now she let herself be part of it. Let herself be just another person in the crowd, anonymous and free. She stopped at a small Italian restaurant she'd never been to before. The kind of place Richard would have dismissed as beneath them. Red checkered tablecloths, candles in wine bottles, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce heavy in the air. The hostess greeted her warmly, led her to a small table by the window. Eleanor ordered wine, ordered pasta, ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching people walk past on the street. No one recognized her here. No one whispered about the Ashford fortune or speculated about the widow's grief. She was just a woman having dinner alone, and there was profound peace in that anonymity. Every person she passed on the street was carrying their own box of secrets, their own hidden closet, their own untold story of love and loss. The businessman in the expensive suit, the young mother pushing a stroller, the teenagers laughing too loud, the elderly couple walking slowly hand in hand. All of them had their own version of Richard's letters. Their own Lily. Their own Eleanor. We were all more alike than different. all struggling with the same fundamental questions. How do we love well? How do we forgive? How do we live with our regrets? How do we move forward when the past weighs so heavily? Richard had never figured it out. He'd carried his regret like a stone in his pocket, feeling the weight of it every day but never putting it down. He'd let his fear make all his decisions. And in the end, he died surrounded by wealth but utterly alone. Eleanor didn't want that ending for herself. She'd spent enough of her life alone in a crowd, isolated in luxury, disconnected from anything real. But we also get to decide what we do with all that weight. We can let it crush us, or we can learn from it. We can let it make us bitter, or we can let it make us wise. We can spend our lives trapped in the story someone else wrote for us, or we can pick up the pen and write the ending ourselves. Eleanor had picked up the pen. It had taken 70 years and the death of her husband and the discovery of a box of letters, but she'd finally picked up the pen. She was writing a new story now. One where she got to be the protagonist instead of the supporting character. One where her choices mattered. One where she wasn't defined by her relationship to Richard, but by who she decided to become. It was terrifying. She'd spent so long being Mrs. Richard Ashford that she barely remembered who Eleanor had been before. That young woman with dreams and hopes and a life ahead of her. But maybe that was okay. Maybe she didn't need to rediscover who she'd been. Maybe she could invent someone entirely new. Eleanor chose wisdom. She chose freedom. She chose to break the cycle of pain Richard had started 50 years ago. She chose to give Sarah and her children the one thing that money can't buy and secrets always steal, the chance to live without the burden of a past they didn't choose. And in making that choice, she finally became the author of her own life. Not Richard's wife. Not the woman he'd left behind. Not the placeholder for a love that belonged to someone else. Just Eleanor. Complicated, flawed, learning, growing, finally free. The townhouse was dark when she arrived home. She turned on lights as she went, making the space warm and welcoming. It was so different from the penthouse with its cold marble and sharp edges. This place had character. History. The floorboards creaked. The radiators clanged. The windows rattled slightly in the wind. She loved it. Eleanor made tea, carried it to the small study she'd claimed as her own. The walls were lined with books she'd bought herself, authors she'd discovered, stories that spoke to her. Not the leather-bound classics that had filled Richard's library, purchased by the yard for decoration. These were paperbacks, well-read, pages dog-eared. Real books that people actually read. She settled into the armchair by the window, looking out at the street. A couple walked by, arguing about something, their voices rising and falling. A cat darted across the street. Someone's television flickered blue through a window across the way. Ordinary life. Beautiful in its ordinariness. The letters remain in the closet. Someday, someone will find them and wonder about the people who wrote them and the people who read them. They'll try to piece together the story from fragments and faded ink. They'll make assumptions. They'll probably get some of it wrong. But that's okay. Because the real story, the one that matters, isn't written in those letters. It's written in the lives that continued after the secrets were revealed. In Sarah's laughter as she watches her children play. In Eleanor's quiet contentment as she discovers passions she'd never had time to explore. In the small daily choices they both make to live with grace instead of bitterness, with hope instead of regret. That's the story worth telling. That's the ending that matters. Not the dramatic reveal or the shocking secret or the billionaire's hidden past. But the quiet, powerful truth that we all have the ability to choose what comes next. That we're not prisoners of other people's choices. That it's never too late to begin again. Eleanor had signed up for a painting class that started next week. She'd always wanted to paint but had never had time, or had been too afraid of not being good at it, or had let Richard's subtle dismissal of creative pursuits discourage her. Now she'd bought canvases and brushes and paint. She had no idea if she'd be any good. She didn't care. The point wasn't to be good. The point was to try. To create. to see what happened when she put color on canvas. She'd also volunteered at the literacy center 3 afternoons a week, teaching adults to read. She'd started last month and already looked forward to those afternoons more than anything else. The gratitude in her students' eyes when a word finally made sense. The pride when they read their first sentence. The possibility of transformation. That's what she was learning about. Transformation. The kind that came not from dramatic gestures but from small, consistent choices. From showing up. From trying. From being present. So if you were in Eleanor's place, what would you choose? Would you hold on to the anger? Would you demand recognition for the years you lost? Would you expose the lies and watch the empire crumble? Or would you do what she did? Take the broken pieces of a life you never asked for and build something new? Would you forgive, not because the person deserves it, but because you deserve the freedom that forgiveness brings? Forgiveness was tricky. Eleanor wasn't sure she'd completely forgiven Richard yet. Some days she felt compassion for the fear that had driven him. Other days she felt rage at the waste of it all. The years stolen. The love withheld. The life she could have lived if he'd been honest from the start. But she was working on it. Because she'd learned that forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It wasn't about saying what they did was okay. It was about refusing to let their choices continue to poison your life. It was about setting down the weight so you could walk freely into whatever came next. And there was so much coming next. Painting classes and volunteer work and maybe, eventually, travel. Eleanor had never been anywhere she actually wanted to go. All those trips had been business, conferences, obligations. Now she thought about Italy, about Greece, about small villages in France where she could drink wine and eat cheese and wander cobblestone streets with no agenda. Maybe she'd even fall in love again. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was 70 years old, but her heart still worked. Still wanted. Still hoped. Maybe there was someone out there who could see her, really see her, not as Richard's widow or a wealthy woman or a tragic figure, but as Eleanor. Just Eleanor. Or maybe not. Maybe the love she needed to find was for herself. Maybe that was enough. Comment below and tell me. If you discovered a secret that changed everything you thought you knew about your life, would you expose the truth or protect the people involved? Would you choose justice or mercy? Would you let the past define your future, or would you write a new ending? Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not billionaires or hidden loves or dramatic deathbed revelations. It's about the choice we all face every single day. The choice to carry our pain or put it down. The choice to stay trapped in someone else's story or brave enough to write our own. Eleanor made her choice. She put down the weight. She walked away from the pain. She chose to live. Not just exist. Not just survive. But actually live. With all the messiness and uncertainty and risk that living required. With the possibility of hurt but also the possibility of joy. With the vulnerability of being seen but also the freedom of being authentic. She finished her tea, rinsed the cup, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow she'd wake up and make breakfast and maybe work in the small garden behind the townhouse. She'd go to the literacy center. She'd have lunch with a woman she'd met at the painting supply store who'd invited her to coffee. She'd come home and read a book just because she wanted to, not because it was on some approved list or would impress anyone. She'd live a small, quiet, ordinary life. And it would be extraordinary because it was hers. The box of letters stayed in the closet. But Eleanor didn't need to read them anymore. She already understood the story they told. A story of fear and regret, of love that went wrong, of choices that defined 3 lives for far too long. Now it was time for a different story. One about resilience. About reinvention. About the quiet, radical courage it takes to start over. A story about a woman who had spent 70 years being what everyone else needed her to be, and finally decided to become herself. That was the story that mattered in the end. Not what Richard had written in his secret letters, but what Eleanor chose to write with the rest of her life. What will you choose? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Not for Eleanor, she had already chosen, but for everyone who heard her story. Everyone carrying their own secrets, their own regrets, their own unopened boxes in hidden closets. What will you choose? To stay trapped, or to break free? To let fear win, or to choose courage? To keep carrying the past, or to finally start living? Maybe the truth is, we all have our own box of letters. The memories, the guilt, the moments we never spoke about. But like Eleanor, we can choose to put them down. To stop letting them define us. To walk forward and write something new. Because every ending is also a beginning. If you were Eleanor, what would you do? Would you tell Sarah everything, or protect her peace? Type truth if you'd reveal the secret, or mercy if you'd keep it buried. I read every single comment. And don't forget to subscribe for the next story. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from.